Hello you, I'm Jordan. Welcome back to the Filmmakers That Inspire Us. Now, if you remember from the previous episodes in this series, this is the show where we look at the life, career and legacy of some of our favourite filmmakers. In today's episode, we get on board a Star Destroyer and look at the life and career of the one and only George Lucas. Come with me.
Chapter 1: Finding the Force Within. George Lucas was not the kind of child who spent every waking hour inside movie theatres. Instead, he grew up as an avid reader, fascinated by history, adventure, and imagination. Books such as Treasure Island and Mutiny on the Bounty helped shape his creative mind long before filmmaking ever entered the picture. During high school, Lucas struggled to stay motivated academically and focused most of his energy on his dream of becoming a professional race car driver. However, everything changed after a devastating car accident nearly taking his life. The long recovery forced Lucas to reconsider his future that ultimately led him down to an entirely new path. Following a close friend, he enrolled at the University of Southern California's film school, with only vague interest in photography and art. Ironically, the future filmmaker had grown up in a household without a television until he was 10 years old. He often admitted he paid more attention to the girls at the movies than the films themselves. Yet at USC, Lucas discovered the passion that would define his life: filmmaking. While many students complained about limited resources and strict assignments, Lucas simply just grabbed a camera and started creating. His relentless drive, willingness to experiment quickly separated him from his classmates. By graduation, he had already built up an impressive portfolio of student films, including the short Look at Life and Electric Labyrinth, which later inspired his first feature, Thanks 138. His determination to make films on his own earned him numerous student awards and studio scholarships, establishing him as a bold, unconventional new voice in cinema at the time. That unconventional style initially clashed with Hollywood studios. Warner Brothers considered Lucas's first feature film too experimental and difficult for mainstream audiences. Disappointed but undeterred, Lucas shifted his focus towards a more relatable story rooted in teenage life and nostalgia. The result was American Graffiti, a coming-of-age film centered around one of unforgettable Saturday night. The movie became both a critical and commercial success, introducing audiences to Lucas's storytelling style, energetic, groundbreaking use of popular music throughout the film. American Graffiti was deeply personal for George Lucas. Inspired by his own memories of growing up in early 1960s California, the film follows a group of teenagers spending one final summer night cruising through town before adulthood began to pull them in different directions. Lucas wanted to capture the freedom, uncertainty, and excitement of youth at the time when cruising culture was beginning to disappear. Teenagers once spent endless nights driving around in search of adventure, music, friendship, and romance, and Lucas transformed those experiences into a nostalgic portrait of a fading American era. Cars became more than just props in the film. They were symbols of identity, freedom, and rebellion. Drawing from his own background as passionate amateur street racer, George Lucas filled the movie with hot rods, coupes, Thunderbirds, and Chevrolets, and other classic vehicles. The energy of the engines, neon lights, and rock and roll music gave American Graffiti a style unlike anything audiences had seen before. Lucas's attention to detail made the world feel authentic and alive, allowing viewers to connect emotionally with the characters and the cultures they represented. Despite its originality, nearly every major studio rejected the project, unsure whether audiences would care about a nostalgic story centered on teenagers and cars. Everything changed, though, when Lucas's friend, Francis Ford Coppola, agreed to support the film as a producer, shortly after the success, of course, of The Godfather. Universal Studios finally approved the project, and production began in California during the summer of 1972. Although filming faced multiple setbacks, including losing permits after only one day in San Rafael, Lucas pushed forward. After difficult editing battles with the studio, American Graffiti was finally released to an enormous success. The film earned 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, and became one of the most profitable films for Lucas. After the success of American Graffiti, George Lucas turned his attention towards an even more ambitious idea, a space fantasy unlike anything Hollywood had seen before. The project that would become Star Wars blended mythology, westerns, science fiction, and classic samurai films into a modern fairy tale about hope, destiny, and the battle between good and evil. At first, studios rejected the idea, believing audiences would never connect with such an unusual concept. Only one executive at 20th Century Fox, Alan Ladd Jr., believed strongly enough in Lucas's vision to take a chance on the film. Star Wars may have seemed revolutionary to audiences in 1977, but at its heart, the story reflected many of the same themes that had already fascinated George Lucas. It centered on a young man longing to escape his ordinary life and chase a greater destiny. What made the film so unique was its setting, a sprawling galaxy inspired by old westerns, Japanese samurai epics, classic science fiction serials like Flash Gordon, and timeless fairy tales. Lucas wanted to create a modern myth, combining the adventurous spirit of the past with groundbreaking, new cinematic storytelling. Getting the film made, however, proved incredibly difficult. Nearly every major studio rejected the project, even after 20th Century Fox agreed to finance it. The production faced constant skepticism, logistical problems. Lucas assembled a talented team to bring his vision to life, including his own visual effects company, Industrial Light and Magic, sound designer Ben Burt, and legendary composer, of course, John Williams. At the same time, he was continuing to rewrite the screenplay until almost filming began, determined to make the perfect story despite mounting pressure from the studio and the enormous scale of the production. Filming officially began in March 22nd, 1976, in the deserts of Tunisia, which doubled as the planet Tatooine. The very first scenes shot featured Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker alongside Phil Brown as Uncle Owen during the Jawa droid sale sequence. From the very beginning, the production was plagued with technical issues. The droids malfunctioned repeatedly, costumes were uncomfortable, special effects failed, and many scenes had to be improvised on the spot. Even simple moments, like the famous droid interactions and early sunset shots, became enormous challenges. Yet Lucas remained calm and focused, quietly guiding his cast and crew through the chaos while continuing to shape the mythology. Despite storms, production delays, and endless technical setbacks, Lucas never lost sight of the larger dream he was trying to create. During filming, important story details continued to evolve, including changing Luke's original surname from Starkiller to Skywalker, and making the crucial decision to kill Obi-Wan later in the film. Lucas believed Star Wars was more than science fiction. As he once explained, the film was a compilation of all those dreams transformed into something entirely new. Against all odds, that vision would go on to change cinema forever. As Star Wars teetered on the edge of collapse in the editing room, it was George Lucas's collaborators who transformed chaos into cinema history. Among them, his ex-wife and editor, Marisha Lucas, made perhaps the most crucial contribution of all, reshaping the cinematic climatic Death Star assault by introducing a ticking clock, the imminent threat to the rebel base on Yavin. Suddenly, the finale pulsed with urgency, sacrifice and suspense, yet it was only a grand change that elevated the film. When Star Wars premiered in 1977, it completely transformed the movie industry and created a cinematic phenomenon. Audiences were amazed by its groundbreaking visuals, immersive sound design, and unforgettable universe filled with strange planets, heroes, villains, and creatures. But beneath the spectacle was a timeless story inspired by Lucas' fascination with history, anthology, and mythological ideas of scholarship. By combining ancient storytelling traditions with cutting-edge filmmaking technology, Lucas created a galaxy that felt both fantastical, deeply human, and forever changing the way audiences experienced movies.
Chapter 2: Building an Empire. After the unprecedented success of Star Wars, come on, let's be real. I grew up in the 70s. It wasn't that successful for the first 10, 15 years. It weren't until they actually stuck it out on like terrestrial television channels that the world actually got to see it. The world expected George Lucas to immediately launch another adventure in a galaxy far, far away. But behind the scenes, the idea of a sequel was far from certain. The making of the original had pushed Lucas to exhaustion, emotionally, creatively, and physically. He had endured studio pressure, budget disasters, and constant skepticism. And by the end of production, he swore he would never direct another film again. In the late 70s, sequels were not viewed as cinematic events, but as cheap attempts to cash in on success. Many filmmakers feared that no matter how ambitious a follow-up might be, it would always live in the shadows of the original. Even director Irvin Kershner later admitted, "We had no idea if there was still an audience for another film." The future of Star Wars was uncertain before it even begun. Like I said, it didn't really kick off until about 15 years after it hit the cinemas for the first time. Lucas knew he couldn't survive directing another production under the same crushing pressure, yet he was equally unwilling to surrender creative control. His original plan was to hire a director who would simply execute his vision, a cinematic extension of himself. Instead, he made a surprising and risky choice by turning to his former film professor and mentor, Irvin Kershner. Unlike many directors in Hollywood, Kershner was not intimidated by Lucas or the phenomena of Star Wars. He brought warmth, emotion, and artistic instinct to a universe previously defined by where Lucas saw machinery and world building. Kershner searched for vulnerability and human conflict. It was a collaboration built not on obedience but creative tension. And that tension would become one of the defining strengths of Empire Strikes Back. At the same time, Lucas was gambling everything he had built. Disillusioned by the lack of faith shown by 20th Century Fox during the making of the first film, he made the radical decision to finance the sequel himself. If the film failed, Lucas would lose not only his fortune, but potentially his entire career. But the production itself became a storm of setbacks and near disaster. Lucas struggled once again with the screenplay and brought in celebrated writer Leah Brackett to help shape the story. Before revisions could even begin, Brackett tragically died, forcing Lucas back into the writing process alone. Meanwhile, much of the original Star Wars crew had departed for rival projects, leaving Lucas scrambling to rebuild his special effects team. from scratch. Then came more chaos. Mark Hamill suffered a devastating car accident which altered his appearance. Harrison Ford refused to commit to future sequels, and the ambitious new character Yoda became a production nightmare involving groundbreaking animatronic puppetry operated by multiple performers under pressure and punishing film conditions. Every step forward seemed met by another impossible obstacle. The greatest challenge still laid ahead. During filming in Norway, the crew endured some of the harshest winter conditions in decades while creating the icy world of Hoth. They also used a lot of the Norwegian and British Army as extras. Cameras froze, film stock snapped in the cold. The blizzards trapped crews for days at a time. Budgets spiraled out of control as Lucas poured more of his own personal fortune into the production. By the time the climactic duel between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader was filmed, there was barely enough money left to finish the set. Smoke streamed, darkness and flashing lights were used. Upon release, Empire Strikes Back divided critics and audiences with its darker tone and shocking ending. But over time, it would become regarded as not only the greatest Star Wars film ever, but as proof George Lucas' impossible gamble has succeeded, changing blockbuster filmmaking forever. Within just 3 months of its release, The Empire Strikes Back had earned back its entire $33 million budget, eventually grossing more than $300 million worldwide and silencing every doubt that had surrounded its creation. For George Lucas, the success was far more than financial vindication. It was proof that his instincts, his risks, and his belief in independent filmmaking had been right all along. Against enormous odds, Lucas had proven himself not just as a visionary creator of worlds, but as a master storyteller, capable of turning myth, emotion, and spectacle into something timeless. Yep, he did do. The story evolved from a simple space adventure into an epic family saga about destiny, fear, loss, and redemption. By the early 80s, George Lucas stood at the centre of a cinematic empire unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen. With Return of the Jedi, Lucas was no longer simply directing films. He was orchestrating an entire creative universe from behind the scenes. Having survived an enormous gamble of financing Empire Strikes Back independently, Lucas once again funded the production himself through Lucasfilm, further proving that blockbuster filmmaking could thrive outside the traditional studio system. Yet despite maintaining total creative control, Lucas had no desire to direct. The scars left by the original Star Wars production still lingers. Instead, he searched for filmmakers capable of translating his imagination onto the screen. Legendary directors such as David Lynch and David Cronenberg were considered, creating tantalizing possibilities of what the saga might have become in their hands. But both declined, leading Lucas to hire Welsh director Richard Marquand, a filmmaker with little experience in large-scale visual effects, but one Lucas believed could work closely with the actors and bring emotional warmth to the story. The screenplay itself evolved under a more enormous pressure. Lucas developed the story alongside Lawrence Kasdan for much of the production. The film carried the more aggressive title Revenge of the Jedi. It just doesn't fit. It really doesn't fit. That name, nah. A name that appeared on a teaser poster and trailers and promotional material before Lucas ultimately decided it betrayed the spiritual philosophy of the Jedi themselves. Revenge suggested hatred and vengeance, emotion tied to the dark side. And so the title became Return of the Jedi. As cameras rolled across England, California, and the Arizona desert, the scale of production became staggering. Filming occupied all 9 stages of L Street Studios, whilst additional sequences transformed the redwood forests of North California into the moon of Endor and the blazing sands of Yuma into the deserts of Tatooine. Massive practical sets were constructed, including Jabba's enormous sail barge, which took months to build and consumed thousands of pounds of materials, whilst Lucas himself quietly directed second unit footage, overseeing miniatures effects. The collaboration allowed the saga to expand visually and emotionally. Secrecy surrounded the production like a military operation to protect the film from journalists, fans, and inflated production costs. Lucasfilm used the fake title Blue Harvest, horror beyond imagination. Behind that disguise, however, Industrial Light and Magic was pushing visual effects technology to its limits. The film demanded an astonishing 900 effects shots, more than double the number used in the original Star Wars. Entire creature workshops were built to bring Jabba's palace to life, led by effects legend Phil Tippett. The new iconic speeder bikes chased through Endor was achieved practical photography techniques with Steadicam inventor Gareth Brown, carefully walking the forest paths at slow speed before the footage was accelerated to create the illusion of impossible velocities. Every frame represented innovation born through exhaustion, experimentation, and ruthless determination. When Return of the Jedi premiered in 1983, exactly 6 years after the original Star Wars, it marked the triumphant conclusion of one of cinema's most ambitious creative journeys. Earning hundreds of millions of dollars and receiving major recognition, he had transformed science fiction from niche entertainment into modern mythology, while simultaneously proving that independent creative control could rival and even surpass the power of Hollywood. The original Star Wars had changed cinema forever. Empire Strikes Back deepened it into tragedy and legend. And Return of the Jedi, Lucas brought his epic full circle, completing the saga that inspired generations of filmmakers, artists and dreamers to believe that imagination itself could reshape the world. I hope you enjoy this. Like, subscribe, and join us. Thank you very much.
Chapter 3: The Rise of Industrial Light and Magic. George Lucas had already begun sketching out the bones of another kind of hero. The project, then titled The Adventures of Indiana Smith, introduced a character Lucas described as a bounty hunter of antiques. Years later, Lucas shared that idea with his friend and fellow filmmaker Steven Spielberg, and the response was immediate enthusiasm. The two met on a beach and left with something more than a conversation, a plan to build a modern adventure franchise inspired by serials they had grown up loving. Their collaboration soon expanded to include writer Lawrence Kasdan, and the trio set up a small development space in Sherman Oaks, Los Angeles. There they spent weeks shaping the character and months refining the story, treating it less like a single film and more like a cinematic ride. The hero would be pursued by Nazis, locked in a race for powerful biblical artifacts like the Ark of the Covenant, and placed in a world where action never paused long enough for comfort. Ideas flew freely between them, including one of Spielberg's most famous contributions, a giant rolling boulder chasing the hero through a collapsing temple corridor. Around these set pieces, they began assembling the identity of their protagonist by drawing from cinematic legends like Clint Eastwood, John Wayne, and Sean Connery, men who combined danger, charm, and authority in a single presence. The character's look became just as iconic as his personality. Kasdan described him in precise detail: khaki trousers, a worn leather jacket, a felt hat, pistol holster, and later the addition of a bullwhip that would become his defining trademark. He was not a superhero, but a professional, an archaeologist with a rough edge. He was in essence a modern action hero shaped by old Hollywood myth-making, someone who could be both scholarly and lethal within the same breath. By 1979, after years of refinement, debate and imagination, the character that had crystallized, he was no longer Indiana Smith, but Dr. Henry Walton Indiana Jones Jr. What began as a loose idea between friends had fully evolved into a cinematic icon. Working closely with writer Lawrence Kasdan and Spielberg, Lucas helped shape Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, and The Last Crusade into a modern revival of serial adventure cinema, blending old Hollywood spectacle with fast-paced, character-driven storytelling. that echoed in his earlier work on Star Wars. At the same time, Lucas was shifting his focus away from directing entirely and toward building the future of filmmaking itself. Through Industrial Light and Magic, he began pushing a radical transformation in visual effects during the late 1980s and early 1990s. What had once been a studio defined by miniatures, matte paintings, and optical composition was now evolving into a laboratory for digital experimentation. Lucas encouraged a move towards computer-generated imagery after early breakthroughs in the films like The Abyss, where digital water effects hinted at what was possible. This momentum carried into landmark projects such as Terminator 2 Judgment Day, where liquid metal effects redefined visual realism, and ultimately, of course, Jurassic Park from 1993, which showed fully digital photorealistic creatures, making it look very convincing alongside live-action actors. To achieve this shift, Lucas empowered a new generation of artists and engineers inside ILM, including figures like Dennis Muren, Steve Williams, and Mark Tippee, who became pioneers of computer animation and digital composition. In 1990, Lucas reorganized the company into Lucas Digital Ltd, integrating ILM with Skywalker Sound to streamline innovation under one roof in San Rafael, California. Within this environment, experimental teams, often working with early systems like the so-called Rebel Mac units, began developing tools for 3D modeling, texture mapping, and digital animation. These advantages allowed ILM to move beyond physical models entirely, transforming visual effects into scalable, computer-driven process and permanently reshaping the language of modern cinema.
Chapter 4: A Galaxy Reforged. Finally, on November 1st, 1994, George Lucas sat down to begin writing what would eventually become Star Wars Episode 1: The Phantom Menace. For Lucas, this return to the Star Wars universe was not simply about continuing a saga, but about finally telling the backstory he had carried for decades. He later explained that the original trilogy had been shaped as carefully and economically as possible, constrained by budgets, technology, and the limits of practical filmmaking. The early films were made for a fraction of what modern blockbusters cost, forcing Lucas to design worlds that could be suggested rather than fully built. Now, with digital tools emerging, he no longer felt restricted by those limitations. With new technology finally available, Lucas saw an opportunity to expand the scale and ambition of his storytelling. The prequels would not just be adventure films, but political and historical epics, exploring the rise and fall of the Republic, the origins of the Jedi, and the deeper structure of the Force itself. He described how characters like Yoda, once limited by puppetry, could now be fully realised in action, and how entire cities, armies, and planets could be created without the physical constraints of models or sets. Digital filmmaking, for Lucas, wasn't just a technical upgrade. It was the key that unlocked stories he had been unable to tell nearly 2 decades earlier. The announcement of Lucas's return to Star Wars sent shockwaves through ILM and the wider film industry. At Industrial Light and Magic, artists and technicians reacted with a mix of disbelief and excitement, fully aware that this would become one of the most important productions in cinematic history. Supervisors and designers across the company began preparing for a project unlike anything attempted before, while Lucas quietly began assembling a new generation of talent. Artists like Doug Chiang and others were brought into the creative fold, reflecting Lucas's desire to blend fresh perspectives with the legacy of early concept design traditions. Behind the scenes, Lucas was also refining the philosophical foundation of the prequel era, building a vast mythology that explained the origins of the Jedi, the Sith, and the Republic itself. The story of Star Wars had always implied a deeper history, but now Lucas was fully determined to articulate it, including the political mechanisms behind the fall of the democracy and the rise of the tyranny under figures like Palpatine. What began as fragments of backstory evolved into a fully structured universe, where the rise of the Empire was not an accident, but the result of ambition, manipulation, and systematic failure. In this way, Lucas returned to his galaxy not to repeat the past, but to complete it, building the origins of a myth he had begun more than 20 years earlier. Artists who had come from traditional miniature and model work, like Gene Bolt and others, found themselves balancing new and old methods, while supervisors like John Knoll pushed towards an increasingly digital future. Even as some filmmakers valued the realism of physical models, Lucas consistently argued that computer graphics represented the future of cinematic storytelling, a shift that would define the evolution of modern visual effects. This technological transformation directly influenced how key scenes in The Phantom Menace were conceived and executed. Lucas redefined the Jedi not as traditional warriors, but as diplomatic peacekeepers, operating in political and moral grey areas. Figures who were powerful yet vulnerable, drawn into conflict rather than born from it. This philosophy shaped scenes like the opening battle aboard the Trade Federation ship, where Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn demonstrated the Jedi in full action for the first time on screen. Similarly, quieter domestic moments such as the dinner scene on Tatooine with Anakin Skywalker and his mother were crafted to ground the story in emotional realism, balancing the spectacle with intimate character detail. Even the absolute mistake of a character that is Jar Jar Binks and his comedic physicality, including his tongue-catching gesture, emerged from Lucas's desire to blend humour into an otherwise political complex narrative world. That same balance of character, philosophy and spectacle reached its peak in the film's climactic duel between Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the absolute legend that was Darth Maul. Lucas designed the confrontation not only as a thrilling lightsaber battle, but as a structural foundation for the saga's future conflicts, by introducing a formidable Sith apprentice and allowing a Jedi Master to fall. He reinforced the idea that even the most powerful figures in the galaxy were not invincible. The fight itself, influenced by classic swashbuckling cinema, moved across multiple environments to heighten its energy and rhythm, echoing the choreography of earlier adventure films while establishing a new visual language for the prequel era. Despite the enormous expectations and intense scrutiny surrounding Star Wars The Phantom Menace, the film became a staggering commercial triumph. Produced with a budget of approximately $115 million today, back then, the movie went on to earn more than $924 million worldwide during its original '99 release, making it the highest grossing film of the year and one of the biggest cinematic events in history. For George Lucas, the success represented more than box office numbers. It was validation that audiences were still willing to return to the galaxy he had created over 2 decades ago. The film's release became a global cultural phenomenon, reigniting Star Wars for a new generation while proving that Lucas's gamble on digital filmmaking and ambitious world building had fundamentally reshaped the future of blockbuster cinema. With the next instalment being Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, George Lucas pushed cinema in an entirely new era by embracing the digital filmmaking on a scale never attempted before. Working alongside engineers from Sony, Lucasfilm helped develop revolutionary high-definition digital cameras capable of capturing footage at 24 frames per second, matching the cinematic motion of a traditional film while eliminating many of its technical limitations. These prototype cameras, custom built with Panavision lenses and delivered only days before production began, represented a radical gamble. Entire crews had to relearn decades of filmmaking practices as sets became filled with cables, monitors, and digital equipment. Yet despite the uncertainty, the technology worked. Under the punishing heat of the Tunisia deserts, for Lucas, this was not simply about replacing film stock, but about freeing filmmaking itself from its physical constraints that had defined cinema for nearly a century. The move to digital transformed every stage of production and also added a lot of blue to the backgrounds, if you know what I mean. For the first time, George Lucas and his crew could instantly review scenes in large high-definition monitors directly on set, allowing cinematographers, costume designers, makeup artists, and set decorators to collaborate in real time. Footage could be transferred immediately into the editing department, where scenes were assembled within hours rather than waiting days for laboratory processing. At the same time, ILM expanded its digital workflow to handle more than 2,000 visual effects shots, integrating CGI creatures, digital environments, and miniature photography into a seamless pipeline. The film's fully digital Yoda, enormous Clone War battles, and intricate virtual environments demonstrated how computer-generated imagery could become emotionally and visibly convincing on an unprecedented scale. Even traditional model making evolved alongside these tools, as miniature sets were now filmed with digitally operated cameras that captured detail with an astonishing clarity. But Lucas understood that technology alone was meaningless without storytelling. For all of the innovation surrounding Attack of the Clones, from digital cinematography to the advanced visual effects and new methods of theatrical projection, the core mission remained unchanged, telling compelling stories through cinema. Lucas often argued that filmmakers had always pushed technology forward in pursuit of new creative possibilities, and digital filmmaking was simply the next evolution of that process. What made Attack of the Clones historically significant was not merely that it used digital tools, but that it proved an entire blockbuster could be conceived, edited, enhanced and distributed through an almost completely digital pipeline. And in doing so, Lucas didn't make another Star Wars film. He accelerated the transformation of the global film industry, helping define how modern movies would be created for decades to come. Chapter 5: The Fall of Mr. Lucas and the farewell to good Star Wars films. By the time George Lucas began production on Star Wars Episode 3, clearly the best one, Revenge of the Sith, digital filmmaking had become central to his creative philosophy. Unlike the original trilogy, which had been restricted by physical limitations and practical effects, Revenge of the Sith was shot fully using digital cameras, allowing Lucas's unprecedented flexibility on both on set and in post-production. Scenes could be reviewed instantly. Visual effects could be integrated more seamlessly, and smaller, lighter cameras allowed for dynamic movement within highly complex environments. The digital format also made it easier to blend live action performances with virtual characters and sets, including the fully CGI version of Yoda, who had now evolved far beyond the limits of puppetry that defined the earlier films. Long before cameras rolled, Lucas had already begun constructing the film through an ambitious process known as pre-visualization. Working with a small team over the course of more than a year and a half, Lucas oversaw the creation of thousands of animated storyboard shots that mapped out action scenes, camera angles, and visual rhythms in a three-dimensional space. This allowed him to experiment with movement and scale before physical production even began, treating the film almost like a fully animated blueprint. By the time filming started, many of the movie's most complicated sequences had already been created and existed in a rough digital form, giving Lucas extraordinary control over pacing, choreography, and visual storytelling. Even after principal photography concluded in 2003, Lucas continued reshaping the story in the editing room, unsatisfied with the aspects of Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side. He undertook major rewrites and reshoots in 2004, shifting the emotional core of the film away from political frustration and towards Anakin's desperate fear of losing his one true love, Padme. This adjustment deepened the tragedy at the centre of the saga, making Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader more personal, emotional, and psychologically grounded. Lucas approached the film with a highly visual directing style, often relying on imagery, composition, colour, and symbolic framing, rather than dialogue alone, because if you've ever seen these movies, you know that any of the love lines in the script written by Lucas are not that good. Inspired by silent cinema and classic filmmaking traditions, he sought to communicate emotion through movement, atmosphere, and visual contrast. Although Revenge of the Sith embraced digital technology more than any previous Star Wars films, because he just had to do it, didn't he? Practical craftsmanship still remained essential to the production. Physical sets, miniature models, costumes and props were extensively combined with an enormous amount of digital environments created by hundreds of artists at ILM. The scale of the post-production effort became almost unimaginable. Sequences such as the volcanic duel on Mustafar required tens of thousands of hours of visual effects work for less than a minute of finished screen time. Yet through this fusion of traditional artistry and digital innovation, Lucas achieved the operatic conclusion that he had envisioned for decades: the tragic fall of Anakin Skywalker and the birth of one of cinema's greatest villains of all time, Darth Vader. The climactic duel between Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi became the emotional and visual centerpiece of the entire prequel trilogy. Choreographed by stunt coordinator Nick Gillard, the battle pushed actors Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor through months of intense lightsaber training, allowing them to perform nearly all of their own stunts, and creating a level of speed and precision never seen before in a Star Wars film. George Lucas originally envisioned the confrontation as a shorter and more savage, but as the story evolved, he reshaped the duel into something far more tragic. Not simply a fight between a hero and villain, but the devastating collapse of a brotherhood. Following major rewrites and re-edits in 2004, Lucas shifted Anakin's fall away. Set against the volcanic nightmare of Mustafar, envisioned by Lucas as a symbolic version of hell in the Star Wars universe, the sequence combined enormous digital environments, rivers of lava, and groundbreaking CGI with operatic visual storytelling. The result was not just an action scene, but the tragic culmination of Anakin Skywalker's transformation into Darth Vader, and the emotional turning point upon which the entire Star Wars saga rested. Upon its release in 2005, Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith became a major global box office phenomenon, earning approximately $850 million worldwide against a production budget of around $113 million. The film then further grossed more than $380 million in just North America alone, and opened to an explosive $108.4 million on its domestic opening weekend, reflecting the immense anticipation surrounding the conclusion of George Lucas's prequel trilogy, finishing as the second highest grossing film of 2005, only behind Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Revenge of the Sith proved that nearly 3 decades after the release of the original Star Wars, audiences remained deeply invested in Lucas's galaxy far, far away. More importantly, the film's emotional ending, chronicling Anakin's tragic fall, brought the 6-film saga full circle, and marked the completion of the story Lucas had spent most of his life building and telling to audiences. Now, you may think that after episode 3, he'd be back for more, but that's not the case, as the franchise took a long pause while George Lucas did initially plan a sequel trilogy. As George Lucas began developing ideas for a sequel trilogy set after Return of the Jedi, he imagined a galaxy struggling through the aftermath of the Empire's collapse. In this fractured political landscape, criminal syndicates and gangsters, particularly the Hutts, would rise to fill the power vacuum left by Palpatine's regime. At the centre of this underworld was the unexpected return of Darth Maul, resurrected from his apparent death and transformed into a ruthless criminal mastermind, ruling the galaxy's chaos from the shadows. Alongside him stood Darth Talon, a Sith apprentice drawn from the expanded universe comics, envisioned by Lucas as a new generation's equivalent of Darth Vader. While Maul consolidated power among the galaxy's crime factions, Luke Skywalker embarked on a far different mission, rebuilding the Jedi Order from almost nothing, with only a handful of surviving Jedi remaining after decades of war and persecution. Luke would travel across the galaxy searching for Force-sensitive children, attempting to restore a tradition that had nearly vanished forever. The contrast between Maul's crime empire and Luke's fragile rebirth of hope reflected Lucas's larger vision for the sequels. A story not simply about restoring peace, but about rebuilding civilization itself after generations of destruction. But then all of that would come to a screeching halt in 2012, where George Lucas would then contact then Disney CEO Bob Iger, with Lucas making the monumental decision to sell Lucasfilm to the Walt Disney Company. Woo! For approximately $4 billion in cash and stock, bringing an end to nearly 4 decades of personally guiding the Star Wars universe. For Lucas, this decision was driven not only by retirement from the enormous responsibility of running his expanding company, but by a desire to ensure that Star Wars would continue to evolve long after him. Rather than allowing the franchise to fade away, he chose to place it in the hands of a studio that he thought at the time, not now, was capable of carrying the galaxy forward for future generations. Oh, he's really going to be regretting that, I think. The acquisition became one of the most significant deals in entertainment history, opening the door to a vast new era of films, television series, and expanded storytelling. Beginning with the sequel trilogy launched by the absolute disaster that was Star Wars The Force Awakens. Although Lucas stepped away from day-to-day creative control, he remained involved during the transition as a consultant, quietly passing the torch and the mythos he had spent his life building. And now look, after a decade of that piece of shit existing, with no direction, look where it's begun, and is continuing to go. Thanks for that, Disney! Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The Filmmakers That Inspire Us. I've been Jordan. We've had narration from my dad and Ed as well. And I hope you have learnt a bit about George Lucas. Join us next time where we're going to be cracking open a dinosaur egg, flying a bicycle in front of the moon as we talk about another legendary filmmaker. See you next time!
From the beginning and action.
In the case of the United States of America versus Rudolph Abel, as to the first count of the indictment, how do you find the defendant?
John, Adam, just bring that gentleman to the service where you are. More right there. I want to see the badge. Bring him in more to right there with the badge. Yeah, right there. And you start really working on him in the audience, because the audience, I think, you've been lunged so bad by the car. If you start working on him and he starts going down on the car, you're up and you're hitting him, and winning on the. Just as you're about to hit him with the fourth time, the kid sticks a knife in the back and stops you. And Pat rallies just in time to see your, this is.
Bring down, suddenly put a pall of death over everything between them. That he's always every once in a while trying to get chummy with her again to maybe cheer her up some more.
In your character right now, I'm just saying, put activity in your character right now, otherwise you're going to just stand there and cry. So I would just walk right past him and throw it all away, cleaning some of it up, We have to leave this table filled with booze because...
Real thrills.